In September 2014, the video game Shadow of Mordor was released by Monolith Productions. At the time, it was the most ambitious single-player Lord of the Rings game ever released, and received a positive reception and won numerous awards. Much of the praise was due to the gameplay and the Nemesis system, which allowed the player to have dynamic rivalries with non-playable orc characters. But this is a lore-focused channel, so given we're close to the 10-year anniversary of Shadow of Mordor's release, let's ask, just how accurate was it? Shadow of Mordor is set sometime between the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The player character, Talion, is a Gondorian ranger of Northman descent who is a captain at the Black Gate, where he lives with his son Dirhael and his wife Eoreth. At the very start of the game, the Black Gate is attacked by forces from Mordor, led by a mysterious figure called the Black Hand, and his two lieutenants, the Tower and the Hammer of Sauron. The garrison is massacred, and Talion, along with his wife and son, are taken prisoner, and then ritually sacrificed in order to summon the Wraith of Celebrimbor. Celebrimbor is summoned, but he instead merges with Talion, preventing him from dying and granting him Wraith-like powers. Thanks to merging with Celebrimbor, Talion has the ability to die and continuously resurrect. Okay, so let's unpack our introduction to the game. Talion being a Gondorian ranger of Northman descent is completely plausible. Many Northmen did move to Gondor, served in its armies, and ultimately ended up living there. However, Talion being stationed at the Black Gate is problematic. While the Gondorians did man the Black Gate for many years, the garrison there was abandoned or destroyed sometime between the years 1944 and 1980, almost exactly 1,000 years before the setting of the game. Thus, the attack on the Black Gate by the forces of Mordor could be accurately representing an actual event that took place, except it's doing it 1,000 years too late. Speaking of the attackers, let's talk about the game's villains. The leader of the attack is the Black Hand, and unfortunately we don't really know anything about him, so it's hard to make a judgment. However, we know a bit more about his two lieutenants, the Tower and the Hammer. Both of these men are Black Númenóreans from the Second Age. The background of the Tower is mysterious, but we know that the Hammer was a Gondorian who fought in the War of the Last Alliance and was corrupted after picking up Sauron's mace. While Black Númenóreans were some of Sauron's greatest servants, the issue with the Tower and the Hammer is their age. Not even Sauron could grant eternal life to men without turning them into wraiths, so the Tower and the Hammer shouldn't really exist. That said, they have amazing designs and have really cool voices, so we can give them a pass. Next, let's talk about the sacrifice. This stuff is partially accurate. Morgoth and later Sauron did convince their followers to take part in human sacrifice. However, there's no evidence of blood magic being a thing in Tolkien's work. Human sacrifice did not grant power, it was just an easy way to corrupt people and a convenient way to get rid of enemies. However, binding spirits, necromancy was a thing, and Tolkien tells us that the spirits of dead elves, who were tainted and refused the call to the halls of Mandos, were susceptible to being enslaved, but only if they were partly willing. There is also an element of truth in Talion being possessed by Celebrimbor, but only a small element. Tolkien did tell us that elven spirits could possess bodies, even living ones. That said, the one being possessed had to be open to it, and this was a mistake, as two spirits could not inhabit the same body. One would be destroyed. On top of that, Celebrimbor inhabiting Talion's body would not bring him back to life, nor would it allow him to continuously respawn, as a body that was too damaged could not house any spirits. And considering these circumstances were already impossible, we can say with confidence that Talion also wouldn't be granted any wraith powers. Okay, let's continue with the story. The next part of the game is spent helping Celebrimbor uncover his own memories, as he's forgotten due to his time as a wraith. Eventually, he remembers that he helped Sauron forge the Rings of Power, but then Sauron betrayed him by forging the One Ring and then attacking Eregion. Celebrimbor valiantly defends, but is overwhelmed by Sauron, and is then taken as a prisoner to Mordor alongside his wife and daughter. There, Sauron uses the One Ring to attempt to dominate Celebrimbor and force him to write the inscription on the One Ring. Celebrimbor does this, but reveals it was a ruse by stealing the One Ring. He uses it to raise an army of orcs to conquer Mordor, but in a final confrontation with Sauron, the One Ring betrays him and he is defeated. He is then forced to watch as his wife and daughter are executed, and then he is killed at last. Alright, there's a lot more to unpack here. I won't say the first part about Celebrimbor losing his memories is inaccurate. There's several examples in Middle-earth of characters forgetting who they are after going through a lot of trauma, including death. The first half of Celebrimbor's memories are also accurate. He and Sauron did forge 16 of the Rings of Power in a partnership, but Sauron, returning to Mordor, forged the One Ring to control all the other rings and their bearers. The elves were aware of this thanks to Celebrimbor's crafting of the three, done without Sauron. So Sauron attacked Eregion, and Celebrimbor did have a last stand outside the House of Myrdain, and was only defeated when Sauron himself showed up. But the rest is, to put it bluntly, nonsense. Celebrimbor was not taken as a prisoner to Mordor, so obviously none of the stuff relating to him being dominated by Sauron, stealing the One Ring, and raising an army to fight Sauron ever happened. Instead, Celebrimbor was tortured in Eregion in an attempt to get him to give up the location of the other Rings of Power. He gave up the location of the 7, but not the 3. He was then put to death, and his body, shot through with arrows, was used as a banner by Sauron's forces. Also, there's no record of him ever having a wife or child. Talion then enlists the help of a group of Gondorian outcasts, led by a man named Hiragon, and he enters into a partnership with a cowardly orc named Ratbag. The reason for this is so Talion can get closer to the Black Hand, and when Talion kills several of the war chiefs and destroys a statue of Sauron, it draws out the hammer, who Talion kills. There's not much to say here. In the real timeline, it would be extraordinarily unlikely that Gondorian outcasts would choose to live in Mordor. Instead, rebels who defected or who were cast out chose to go south to Harad and Umbar instead. You know, places where other men actually lived. As for Ratbag, while there aren't any instances in Tolkien stories of individual orcs siding with individual men, we know that orcs aren't mindless monsters who could work with men. In the case of Ratbag, it isn't crazy to assume that an ambitious yet craven orc could be willing to work with a man if it meant there was some personal gain, especially at a time when Sauron hadn't officially returned and his domineering will wasn't imposed on him. Afterwards, Talion goes to Nirn after being found by Lithariel, the daughter of Queen Marwen of Nirn, a land that is inhabited by men related to the Corsairs of Umbar. Marwen insists that Talion use Celebrimbor's powers to take control of an army of orcs and then use that army against Sauron. However, Marwen is also acting strangely. It then becomes apparent that she was possessed by Saruman after she went to him to request help against Sauron. Saruman attempts to take control of Celebrimbor, but he is stopped and Marwen is freed. Nevertheless, Talion follows through with the plan, using an army of orcs to attack a place called Ered Glamhof, where he kills the tower. Upon his return, he finds Nirn ablaze. It's been attacked by the Black Hand, and Marwen and Lithariel are missing, presumed dead. There's plenty more here. First, we know that Nirn was inhabited by men, but these men were Sauron's slaves. Before his return, we're unsure whether men were native to Nirn, but if they were, they probably wouldn't have been related to the Corsairs, considering Umbar was quite far away. On top of that, Marwen and Lithariel's names probably wouldn't have been, well, those names, considering that those names are Sindarin, and there's no reason why the descendants of the Corsairs in Nirn should have Sindarin names. Another strange addition is Marwen being possessed by Saruman. The whole Saruman possessing people is a movie invention. Theoden was being poisoned, not possessed, and there's no evidence that Saruman could possess people, so that's kind of all nonsense. But at this time, Saruman hadn't been ensnared by Sauron, even though he was solely in it for himself. So it makes sense that he would help Marwen and then advise Talion and Celebrimbor to attack Sauron. However, once again, him trying to remotely absorb Celebrimbor's power is also nonsense. As for dominating orcs, they are weak-willed creatures, so it is possible if you're strong enough, like Saruman or Sauron. This is a high barrier to pass. Isildur, wielding the One Ring, could not do it yet, so Talion certainly wouldn't have been able to do it either. Talion empowered by Super Wraith Celebrimbor? Probably not, but we'll give it a pass for gameplay purposes. When it comes to the locations, Ered Glamhof is a funny one. It's non-canon, but it doesn't just appear in Shadow of Mordor. It also appeared in fan-made content on a site called Land of Shadow, and it also appears on the map in the Lord of the Rings Online. Nirn is reasonably well represented in the game as a greenish region. It probably was, given it was Mordor's breadbasket. It being attacked by Sauron's forces is also plausible, but in the actual timeline as opposed to the games, so 1,000 years earlier. By the time of the game, Nirn was almost certainly already under Sauron's control. The final act of the game sees Talion return to the Black Gate, where he finally confronts the Black Hand himself, but the Black Hand is able to incapacitate Talion and then kills himself. which forces Celebrimbor from Talion's body and into his own. This allows Sauron to take physical form by possessing the Black Hand, but Celebrimbor is able to incapacitate Sauron from within, which allows Talion to destroy Sauron's physical form before he can do any more damage. This leaves the Black Hand dead, and Celebrimbor, having gotten at least some revenge, now wishes to depart to Valinor, but Talion convinces him to stay, saying that they can defeat Sauron together. In the final moments of the game, they decide to forge a new ring. Okay, so this whole bit is a bit ridiculous. The whole sequence of the Black Hand killing himself, which forces Celebrimbor into his body, which allows Sauron to take control of his body, is kind of weird, and it makes so little sense that I don't really know how to explain how it's wrong. I mean, it's both Sauron and Celebrimbor apparently possessing a new corpse. I don't know. All I can say is that at this time, Sauron did have a physical body again, no need for Celebrimbor or any possession, and Talion killing his new physical body would set Sauron back another 1,000 years, just as it had before. As for the end of the game, Celebrimbor wishing to depart to Valinor is completely valid. I mean, firstly, there's nothing that says Celebrimbor didn't go to the Halls of Mandos in the first place, but even after the whole revenge arc thing, there would be nothing stopping him. But Talion stops him because Celebrimbor departing would kill Talion. We literally see that whenever Celebrimbor departs his body, his throat opens back up. Once again, this doesn't really make sense. Celebrimbor's spirit shouldn't be keeping Talion's body alive. As for the new ring, well, that will be talked about in the video about Shadow of War. Ultimately, Shadow of Mordor played pretty fast and loose with the lore. There were major issues with the premise, the timeline, the characters, and the use of magical powers in the game greatly exceeds anything Tolkien described. That being said, there were occasional things that the game got right, or at least portrayed in a somewhat plausible manner. And to be honest, when it comes to the lore, there's plenty of things that the game did that other adaptations of Tolkien's work had already done, so it's unfair to single Shadow of Mordor out. On the other hand, Shadow of War, well, that's for a future video. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I actually wanted to do this video for a long time, but it was like, it's kind of random to pull out of nowhere. But then I noticed that we're nearing the 10-year mark of when the game came out, so what better time to shit on it? No, not really. I did enjoy Shadow of Mordor and played through it twice, same with Shadow of War. I'm not a purist or a prude, this video is just for fun. Cheers, farewell, and remember, sacrificing yourself will not bring Sauron back.